Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Coming up, the Conservative Party's fourth wave paranoia, a politician apologizes for supporting freedom, and a look at Alberta's upcoming equalization referendum.
The Andrew Lawton Show starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. It is Monday, August 9th, 2021. Great to have you tuned into the program. As of yet, still no election, though all signs are pointing to, if you listen to the whispers that are coming out of Ottawa and the Parliamentary Press Gallery and political circles, an election will be coming up in just a few days' time, potentially. It could be any moment now. By the time I finish this show, we could be in election mode. And still, the Conservative Party of Canada is not ready. Remember in 2015, when the Conservatives were going up against Justin Trudeau, that was their whole message, that he's just not ready. And the Conservatives are now applying to themselves the same line that they were trying to use to take down Justin Trudeau in 2015. They don't want an election. They just do not want to go to the polls. Now, they don't come right out and say that they're not ready for an election. They say, as we talked about last week, oh, well, it's dangerous. We've got a Delta-driven fourth wave spike coming. Who knows what other variants are just going to be around the corner. And I made a prediction. I'm noting this now because I specifically said I rarely make predictions because I don't want to be wrong. But I did make one very clear prediction last week. I talked about some of the rhetoric we were hearing from staffers of O'Toole team, that things were a little concerning, that they were worried about COVID and having an election during a pandemic and all of that. And I said, this seems to be a test balloon for lines we're going to hear before long from Erin O'Toole. Then over the weekend, this comes.
Canadians are worried about a fourth wave of COVID-19. The dangerous Delta variant is here, and we have to be ready. Now is not the time for an election. We can all wait and go to the polls when it's safe. We need to focus on health and well-being, securing our economic future, and fighting COVID-19 together. My wife and I had COVID. Like many families, we want to get past this pandemic, but let's pull together for one more fight. Let's beat COVID-19 and have an election when it's safe.
Oh, we hit all the check boxes there. Dangerous Delta variant. Canadians are worried about a fourth wave. Now is not the time. I don't actually buy into that premise that Canadians are terrified of this existential threat that is the looming fourth wave. I think that people have been able to, by now, make their own determinations about risk. Those who wanted to get vaccinated got vaccinated. Those who didn't are dealing with the consequences or lack thereof, depending on what they think about their decision. But the reality is, Canadians are going to go forward, and as most of the experts are now saying, this involves learning to live with COVID in the world, learning to live with COVID in our country and in our communities. Deena Hinshaw, the Chief Medical Officer of Health in Alberta, has had the most clarity on this position, saying that the point was never going to come where we were just going to be able to flip a switch and say COVID's over. It's about how we adapt and live our lives around it. Cases are irrelevant. Hospitalizations are down, deaths are down, and these are the metrics that should matter more than the cases on which the media seems to be resting its alarmism. So this idea that there is this looming Delta-driven fourth wave terror that is so bad, democracy must be suspended. That's the whole thing. Not just that there's an uptick, but that things are so bad that Canada is incapable of having an election simply is not true. And I laid out my two theories on this last time, and I'll restate them now. Either the Conservatives are true believers on this, they're buying into this fear-mongering, or they simply just aren't ready for an election. And I think everyone is lining up in that latter column here. That the Conservatives just see this as being the best possible way they can try to delay this because they don't want to head right into a defeat. And I get it, you don't want to lose elections. Ideally, you go into them and want to win them. But the focus should be, how do we win the election, not how do we try to delay the inevitable. Now, a lot of Canadians get very annoyed with elections. Minority governments are inherently unstable. Stephen Harper had a minority in 2006 that lasted 2 years, got 3 years out of the 2008 minority, but we know they do not last forever. So the idea that we were going to have a 4-year-long election term after Trudeau was taken down to a minority was just never going to happen. So the question then becomes, what is the best timing for the election? And I'm not one of these people that actually thinks an election is a bad idea. I think that you have a huge situation in Canadian politics that was unforeseen in 2019. You've got COVID. You've got a government that is trying to move its agenda forward. I don't happen to agree with a lot of that agenda, but the government is trying to move its agenda forward. And then on the other side of that, you have Canadians that will have in an election the opportunity to assess whether that government is on the right track, about its pandemic response, about its spending, about any number of other things that have topped the Liberal government's agenda. So I would actually say this is probably the first time I've agreed with something Justin Trudeau does about democracy and elections if they go down that road that we all think is happening and are pretty confident is going to happen, which is calling an election, because it's giving Canadians the opportunity to basically say, yeah, you are able to stick around, or no, you're not. Now, the caveat here is that Justin Trudeau has been running for re-election for months, going across the country doing spending announcement after spending announcement after spending announcement, while opposition parties are waiting. So in that sense, there is an unfairness there because he knows his plans, he knows what he's going to be doing, and it's the other parties that have just sort of waited, and they don't have the opportunity to go and hand out taxpayer money as part of this pseudo-campaign that they aren't really saying is a campaign. But the point is, an election is an opportunity for Canadians to tell the government they don't want them around. With any government, that is the very nature of elections. So when you are the opposition, as the Conservative Party is, the official opposition, you should be welcoming the opportunity to put your agenda to the taxpayers, to the voters, ahead of your opponents, ahead of the government. And the point here, when I see this video from Erin O'Toole, which just comes across as the most disingenuous message imaginable, I'm like, well, what have you been opposing and criticizing the government for if you think that that government is the steady hand that should be buckling down and getting Canadians through this deadly fourth wave? If there is a deadly fourth wave coming and things are that bad, what the Conservatives have now said is that Justin Trudeau is the guy to steer Canadians through it. And that's not exactly a winning message when it comes to politics. So last week, we started to see this coming from Erin O'Toole staffers, from Conservative campaign people. Now this is the message of Erin O'Toole. And it's obviously not something that they're completely buying into, if they are at all. He's still campaigning. They've still got their campaign studio in downtown Ottawa. Their candidates are still knocking on doors. So clearly, they haven't suspended their campaign because of this threat. Erin O'Toole was at the Calgary Stampede, shaking hands, posing for photos. Clearly, they do not buy into this. Nor should they. I don't want them to be alarmists. I just don't want them to pretend to be alarmists because they think it gives them just a slight political edge for, half a second when an election is called, and they want to claim that Justin Trudeau is being irresponsible with it. That is not helping us get out of all of these lockdowns. Like, the battle lines are very significant here. Just look at what's been going on between the federal government and the provincial government. You have Patty Hajdu, who is calling out Alberta for reopening. So again, the permanent emergency. These people want a permanent lockdown. Patty Hajdu wants Alberta to pony up its documentation to give evidence to justify its reopening. And this is a letter that Patty Hajdu sent, which is absolutely insane. She says, it is now incumbent on all governments across Canada to exercise caution and vigilance to keep everyone safe in our jurisdictions and neighboring ones as well. She just wants to better understand the science and rationale used. Alberta, like I mentioned earlier, is no different than many other jurisdictions. It's maybe seen a few cases here and there, but deaths and hospitalizations, the metrics that matter, are virtually non-existent. And I don't think anyone in Canada believes Patty Hajdu when she says, well, anything, but when she talks about the federal modeling, which has been wrong at pretty much every turn. This is a clip from Jason Kenney's response to Patty Hajdu's letter, which basically says the federal government could go pound salt, Alberta is open.
I find this ironic coming from a minister who refused to close the borders of COVID hotspots at the very beginning of the pandemic. who effectively facilitated the entry into Canada of the virus. When other countries like in East Asia immediately shut their borders in January and February of last year, Minister Hadju was arguing to keep them open as long as she could, even from the worst hotspots in the world. She still hasn't taken responsibility for that incompetent and dangerous decision. She was arguing against masks. She was following blindly the mistaken advice of the World Health Organization that there was not a pandemic until they finally changed their tune in March. So we're not going to take lectures from Minister Hadju, particularly when it appears that she and her boss, Justin Trudeau, are hell-bent on a federal election campaign. If they really are that concerned about COVID, then why is she getting ready to start putting up campaign signs? It is, I think this is just an obvious political ploy, and it's divisive. I would ask that the federal government respect the expert advice of each province's public health officials, in our case, our brilliant Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Hinshaw. The plan that we are moving forward with was designed by Dr. Hinshaw and her team in order to address all public health challenges and recognize that there's not just one health challenges that we face as a society. So I at least respect her expert advice, and it would be nice if the federal government would show similar deference.
And I should point out here that this is not just a political battle between the federal health minister and the Alberta premier. The government officials that have been pushing lockdowns and restrictions have been telling us for a year and a half now that we have to listen to the experts and listen to the science. Alberta has been very transparent with it. Deena Hinshaw, their Chief Medical Officer of Health, has been remarkably clear in her communication about Alberta's plan and about why Alberta is pursuing the route it is. And she wrote an op-ed in the Calgary Herald just a few days ago in which she talked about this. She went in a very clear manner, the kind of communication that we wish had been coming from public health officials for most of the last year and a half. And she talked about, again, there's not going to be this COVID-0 pandemic over moment. We have to adjust and we have to adapt. And she is the expert. She's the public health official. And it's interesting that all of the lockdown-happy goons in so many governments have been telling us to listen to the experts until an expert disagrees with their lockdown narrative. And this is when it becomes very revealing that it's not about listening to the experts, it's about listening to their experts. No, the second that someone with a bunch of letters after their name, no matter how esteemed they are, no matter how well regarded they are, the second they go against the government narrative, well, they're no longer an expert. We can't listen to them. So yeah, we have to listen to Theresa Tam. We don't listen to Deena Hinshaw. There was this one guy that in Alberta that the media has held up as an expert, Dr. Joe Vipond. And well, we have to listen to him because he's telling us all the things we want to hear. He's having pro-lockdown rallies, which I don't even understand how you justify doing that when it involves leaving your home. And then, of course, he's been a tens of thousands of dollar donor to the Alberta NDP, which CTV finally came around to reporting after True North, but I'm going to give the edge to my colleagues over at True North who pointed that out, again, hidden in plain sight. But these people are politicians. They're not public health officials in a lot of cases. They're political figures pushing a political agenda. So Deena Hinshaw, who at the beginning of the pandemic everyone was holding up as great, now they're throwing her to the wolves because they don't like that she's actually giving a province license to reopen. Do not doubt for a moment that so many of the voices from whom we've been hearing that we're told to trust blindly do not want reopening to happen. They want the control. They want the control that comes with keeping people in a permanent state of emergency. We've seen in Canada and around the world, but particularly in Canada, how eagerly and willingly people hand over their civil liberties to the government. Do not doubt that this will become a template that is used in any future emergency or pseudo-emergency. And I don't like saying things that sound like they are conspiratorial. But it's not even predicting the future to just point out what's happened and say, yeah, this will continue to happen. And listening to the experts is not about that. It's about listening to their experts. And I want to actually show a clip from Deena Hinshaw when I talk about the clarity of communication, so you understand what she's been doing. She's been very transparent. She's actually been doing the rounds, a number of interviews with a variety of outlets over the last couple of weeks, and she's been talking about why it is that Alberta's doing what it's doing. So again, for Patty Hajdu to say, well, you need to turn over your evidence, well, just turn on a TV.
You know, this won't come as news to you, but a number of medical experts have criticized your decision, including the Canadian Pediatric Society and the Alberta Medical Association. So, you know, why are you confident that this is the way to go at this stage in the pandemic?
Sure, and I just want to be clear about the process in Alberta. So I make recommendations to cabinet committees, and then their decision is what informs policy. And then the orders that are carried out are the tool that implements the policy decision. So just want to be clear that there's always that interplay, and the recommendation is certainly mine. So in terms of why I believe this is the right step for Alberta at this time, it's really twofold. One is about I believe I have an obligation to continually assess the proportionality of the requirements that I place on Albertans province-wide in terms of legal mandates to do or not do certain things. And I need to continually assess the province-wide risk and whether or not that meets the test of requiring those particular interventions. So as you may know, the majority of public health measures were lifted on July 1st. We have been watching cases since then. There has been, as you mentioned, an uptick. We've seen our acute care admissions holding roughly steady. So we know that the vaccination that we have widely available can disrupt that connection between cases and severe outcomes. And so we, like Saskatchewan did on July 11th, are planning to lift that provincial-wide mandatory requirement for isolation and quarantine, and as BC did earlier in July, lifting the mandate province-wide for masking in transit, taxis, and ride shares. We will be maintaining some specific measures in high-risk locations like acute care and continuing care, and so there are measures in place that will not be changing. And at the same time, we're going to be moving from a province-wide approach to really looking specifically at local interventions where they're needed. So if we have surges of cases leading to acute care impacts, being able to target those particular locations with measures that are needed, as opposed to, again, the mandate at a province-wide level.
As I said, clear, direct, and going against the grain of the prevailing state narrative right now, so therefore worthy of cancellation. No matter how many letters she has after her name, how many degrees, how many accolades, nope. She's telling people they don't need to live in fear, and we can't have any of that taking place in Canada now. And it's amazing how the bounds of society, of polite society, what people are allowed to say or allowed to think, getting ever and ever narrower throughout the course of the pandemic. Even when someone accidentally stumbles into the right train of thought, they have to apologize. This one is great. My province, Ontario, has an NDP leader, Andrea Horwath, who has been reasonably capable as an NDP leader, but she came out and opposed mandatory vaccinations. Now, at a time when that's becoming one of the big cultural battles, this was a big thing. And I think a part of this was because she's heavily influenced by unions as an NDP leader. Public sector unions don't like the idea of their members being forced to be vaccinated. So she talks about the importance of charter rights. Again, not something we're used to hearing about from a New Democrat, but I will take it.
Unlike Mr. Del Duca, I don't take lightly people's charter rights. And so that's why what we're saying is rapid tests or your vaccination status and being vaccinated. So vaccination or rapid test before going to work. It's the very least we could be doing, we should be doing to make sure that folks are safe at school, that our students are safe at school, that our workers, our education workers and teachers are safe at school. I really think that we can't simply ignore that there are folks that are not going to get vaccinated, and I don't think that the right thing to do is just to shut them out, as it appears that Mr. Del Duca is prepared to do.
So she does that interview. She makes what I think is a perfectly valid point. The backlash she received was insane, and it was actually concerning to just pay attention. I mean, paying attention to Twitter is oftentimes not enjoyable, but it was crazy to just look at how many people were so angry at someone for opposing mandatory vaccination, which is one of the most egregious policies a government could come up with, to force people to inoculate themselves with something if they don't want to be. In any case, so this happens, and she was apparently receptive to it because then she shared this video in which she completely reversed course.
Hello, Ontario. I've always been a strong advocate for doing everything we can to ensure every Ontarian is vaccinated. This is especially critical in healthcare and education. I fully support mandatory vaccination in healthcare and education based on science and public health priorities. I should have made that position clearer much earlier in support of the health and safety of the most vulnerable among us: seniors, people with disabilities, people who are sick, and children who can't yet get their vaccines. I also believe we need to reach out to people, find out what their barrier is, and address it. Whether that's paid time off for a gig worker or taking the vaccine directly to the home of a single parent with 2 jobs and 2 kids. Doug Ford has failed to do that work. On Wednesday, I made a mistake suggesting a mandatory vaccine policy during a global pandemic should take a back seat to charter rights. I regret the comment. I was wrong. My fight and my focus must be on keeping people healthy and safe. This unprecedented time requires unprecedented actions. It's time to make sure every education and healthcare worker gets the protection of a vaccine. Now, let's work together to convince Doug Ford.
She made a mistake to say that mandatory vaccines should take a backseat to charter rights. In the tweet accompanying her video statement, "I made a mistake yesterday raising charter rights. I was wrong." When is raising civil liberties, when is raising constitutional freedoms a mistake? Like, this is completely why some people, as I've mentioned, have been completely allergic to victory. This is why the NDP in Ontario is doomed to be the permanent perpetual opposition party, because they apologize for valuing freedom. By the way, I don't even know if they value freedom on a day-to-day basis, but in that one interview, they valued freedom, and now this is something that apparently warrants an apology. Now, in this case, it probably works for her politically because her base doesn't support the charter. Why would you appeal to charter rights when your base doesn't seem to care about those things? That was clearly the problem, that all of these people that she was expecting would be behind her were actually not, because they all support mandatory vaccine now. And I don't buy this distinction that mandatory vaccine for healthcare workers is distinct from mandatory vaccine. At a certain point, if the state is making your employment conditional on getting vaccinated, it's as though the state is mandating it, because you are creating this stratified society, which is not something that we should at all be welcoming or inviting. It's the same as a lot of this allyship culture we see in other areas. It's not enough just to agree with someone's right to live their life. You have to actively be on the front lines fighting against the enemies of that position. So standing up for free speech in a conversation about mandatory vaccines, standing up for vaccine choice, standing up for the freedom to decide what you put into your own body, nope, that is not allowed. So if she gets turfed in a leadership review, that'll be the reason. It will have nothing to do with electoral results. Is that she has gone against, as we said with Dr. Hinshaw, the official narrative, and that right now is an unforgivable sin in Canadian politics. Before we take a break here, I want to put in a plug for our friends over at secondstreet.org. You may wonder, well, what can be done about rising government debt, about long healthcare waiting lists, unemployment? Well, secondstreet.org has co-authored a free ebook, Life After COVID. So you can download your copy of that free ebook and find lots of other great stuff that they're working on over at www.secondstreet.org.
You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to the Andrew Lawton Show. We've spoken a fair bit about the upcoming equalization referendum that Albertans will be able to participate in October. I spoke about this with Premier Jason Kenney a few weeks back. And one of the big questions is if Albertans decide to vote in favor of this, to basically reevaluate Alberta's relationship with the rest of Canada as it pertains to equalization, does the federal government even have to pay attention to it? There was a great op-ed in the National Post looking at this very question, and it said the feds will have a duty to listen if Albertans vote against equalization. This was written by Dr. Bill Bewick, the Executive Director of Fairness Alberta, who joins me now. Bill, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So what is the question? Let's start there. What is it that Albertans are actually going to be voting on in October?
The question will be asking if Albertans want to remove the section from the Constitution that affirms a principle of making equalization payments.
And this is a federal program, not a provincial one. So we get now to the enforceability of it. If Albertans do vote overwhelmingly or even narrowly for this, what does that compel the government to do, if anything, at the federal level?
Well, there's some dispute about that, but in the 1998 Supreme Court reference case regarding Quebec secession, they of course went further into what secession would entail. But a few times in that judgment, they just sort of affirmed a general principle that if there's a province that's so upset about something in the Constitution that it's causing enough political consternation in a province that they have a referendum to change the Constitution, that the rest of the country needs to pay attention to that. And the federal government and the other provinces have a duty to engage in discussions, engage in constitutional discussions, it says at one point. And it's just sort of common sense that if you have, any of your partners in Confederation are that upset about something, and they have a referendum where the people's will explicitly says that this isn't just, some politicians trying to score points, or it's not just somebody, doing political purposes. This is the people are upset enough that they want some change, that you can't just ignore it, and that you have to engage with the province in good faith and discuss the problem.
But you don't have to go along with it. You have to have a discussion.
Of course,
is that basically the standard?
There's an amending formula for the Constitution, and that this does not in any way meet that threshold of 7 provinces and 50%. But it's just a way of, arguably letting off steam, but more importantly, in re-engaging with a province that has a real problem and is frustrated and needs something addressed. So it's just kind of common sense that you wouldn't just brush that off in a way that it's probably easier to brush off a political leader who's asking the feds for something. Maybe he's in a different party. Maybe there's other motives going on. But when the people of a province speak up loudly that they need something addressed, the federal government has a duty to address it.
And that's actually a very key point, because a few weeks back when Premier Jason Kenney was sitting down with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Premier Kenney had put to him the upcoming Alberta Senate elections, which are also going to be in October, and had asked Trudeau to hold off on appointing any senators for Alberta until Albertans could put a candidate forward. And Trudeau basically said, yeah, that's not how we do things, and gave, to use your words, the brush off there. So in that sense, having an obligation to, no, you're going to sit down, you're going to talk about this, forces you to respond to it, because then, voters, other premiers, the media can ask you, okay, well, what did he say? What did you say to him? And I think there's an obligation to at least take something out of it if you have to go into that engagement process.
Yeah, and another example is the another sort of thing that critics of this approach point to is, why can't you just bring it up with the premiers at the Council of the Federation? Why can't you just work through the normal channels? And I would say, well, one, there's about 5 provinces who receive a lot of their funding from this, or at least a significant chunk that they're not going to want to just go. They don't want any negotiations because they're pretty happy with how things are. But there are 5 other provinces that are paying into this without getting anything. So you could have a little 5-on-5 at the Premier's Conference. But when you look at 2019, the Alberta government did get every single premier to unanimously agree to give Alberta a significant retroactive payment of $5-6 billion. Because in 2015, Alberta's revenues dropped $8 billion. That was 20% drop in revenues. And so there's this program called fiscal stabilization that is meant to cushion the blow when you have a sudden drop in revenues like that. But it was it had a 60 per person cap, $60 per person, which meant that Alberta got $250 million on that $8 billion drop, which was about a 3% insurance payment, which is obviously not stabilizing anything. And so partly out of recognition for all that Albertans have contributed to other provinces through our taxes that we pay, which is much more than we get back, the rest of the premiers said, please give Alberta this retroactive, change the program, which could benefit all of them conceivably, but give Alberta a retroactive payment, which obviously only helps Alberta. And it's pretty unusual, I think, to get every premier to agree to give one province money. I mean, it's easy to get them to all agree to ask the feds to give them all more money, but this was a pretty significant win, and the feds just ignored it. So I don't know. I mean, part of this is for those who criticize the process, well, what would you do? Because the status quo isn't good enough. There's a lot of people in Alberta that are getting increasingly frustrated. I put out posts on these topics, and the number of people who are so upset that they want to leave the country that speak up is troubling. So we have a serious problem here, and it's not just it's too easy, I think, for some politicians and groups in Canada to sort of write off Alberta, demonize Alberta, mock Alberta, but that's not going to last much longer before more serious things happen. So I feel like this referendum is a really good sort of first step in saying, hey, we're not happy. Can we get this addressed?
Yeah, and I think you are right to point out that chapter in Canada where other provinces had agreed to give Alberta money, because that actually reinforces that the equalization formula does not entirely capture the economic realities. And this is still a problem that Alberta is contending with now, where the economic situation in Alberta, which has been hit not just by the pandemic, like many other provinces, but oil and gas related issues as well, it's still not being reflected in the equalization formula. So even if someone is committed to equalization, surely they should be able to look and say, the way we do this isn't really working right now.
Yeah, so there's two things going on here. One is the symbolic attempt to get some recognition for all that Albertans have contributed and how little we've gotten back from the country for decades. Mm-hmm. But then, so this is an avenue to address that. But equalization is seriously flawed. The provinces since 2015 have come much closer together in fiscal capacity is the way they measure the kind of wealth and ability to pay for services. Alberta, Newfoundland, Saskatchewan, we used to lead the country in 2015, and it's really come down with the energy downturn, so that the provinces it was about a $5,000 gap between the median have and have not. Now it's about $1,600. And when you think of the different costs of services in places like the Maritimes and Quebec versus Ontario and Vancouver and Alberta, that's basically nothing. So the provinces are more close together than ever, which means equalization is less necessary than ever, if at all. I would argue maybe New Brunswick and PEI are far enough below the average that maybe something there would be fair. But Quebec and Ontario are getting increasingly close, especially if you use a factor like the cost of services. So it's less necessary than ever, and yet the payments have grown to $21 billion this year. They're tied to GDP, and they grow every year regardless of the need. And so we've got massive payments going out, at least $10 billion more than what is justified, which means that there's just $10 billion that all Canadians are paying into that are going just to 30% of the country to pay for provincial services. And this is at a time when Alberta is saying, we need more funding for provincial services. Ontario is saying, we need more funding for provincial services. Well, you're paying for provincial services a lot more than you think. It's just that Ottawa is sending those dollars specifically to 5 provinces.
One of the concerns that I've seen from this, and you touched on it a bit earlier when you talked about the independent sentiment, is that a lot of people that think this doesn't go nearly far enough, that think, you know what, the problems are not going to be fixed. They're certainly not going to be fixed now. And it seems like there's a bit of resistance to this referendum that's coming from the other side of it, from the independents. And I'm curious, as someone in Alberta, how much you see that as being a factor here.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the frustration. It is frustrating, but at the same time, we're only sort of 11.5% of the country. We have to understand, and we have sort of different interests than a lot of than other sections of the country. So there is a sort of systemic issue that we will always have to deal with. And so I do understand why people think it's fruitless and hopeless and will never get anywhere near close enough. But from our perspective is that we need to try, and that there isn't really too many groups that have really tried to do what we're doing, which is telling the rest of Canada the facts, saying here's how much Albertans have been contributing, here's how vital Alberta's economy and economic prosperity has been to the rest of the country, here's all the spillover effects when it comes to either taxes or jobs that the rest of the country benefits from. And just try to shift the perspective for the rest of the country from thinking that somehow Alberta's lucky and has a bunch of free money and that somehow their success comes at our expense, and say, no, Alberta's energy sector is a huge source of productivity. And when it's functioning well, the spillover effects for the rest of the country are enormous. And so, get people to realize that a good Alberta is really good for the whole country, and that the country needs that prosperity right now more than ever as we try to come out of this COVID mess. And so we're going to do a good faith exercise here, and we'll see where that can get us.
Bill Bewick, Executive Director of Fairness Alberta, great op-ed in the National Post called "If Albertans Vote Against Equalization, the Feds Will Have a Duty to Listen." Bill, thanks so much for coming on. Great to talk to you.
Yeah, my pleasure, Andrew. And it's a pretty critical time in the next few months here, so I encourage people to go to fairnessalberta.ca and see the information we're providing. And we can only function on the generosity of donors, so please consider a donation if you like what we're doing.
Perfect. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew.
That was Bill Bewick of Fairness Alberta. We've obviously been covering Alberta independence because no one else in the mainstream media is in any substantive way. And when they do, it's oftentimes through the lens of, oh, look at these, disgruntled hillbillies, not realizing the very real concerns and very long-standing concerns that people in the West have. And it isn't just about Alberta. It's about a province's ability, a province's right to assert its own agenda. And it's interesting that we have all of these politicians that will tiptoe around Quebec, refuse to tell Quebec no, but when Alberta tries to do the same thing, in fact, not even the same thing, a pared down version of it, it gets mocked and vilified. So that's why we're standing up, and I hope you'll continue to as we head towards the referendum in October. We've got to end things there. We'll be back in a couple of days' time, however, with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show on True North. Thank you, God bless, and good day.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.